settlements in your family mediation. Before we start, 4 quick things that I wanted to share. First of all, I'm only giving 10 tips. I have way more than that, but I don't want to bore you. And I want to save some in reserve in case this goes well and I get asked back next time. Second point, there's only 10 tips, but I tried to divide them up equally. So 5 of the tips are parenting related and 5 of them are financial. And I thought that was appropriate because in my mediations, I do equal amounts of financial and parenting mediation. And as Marianne mentioned, I'm also looking forward to doing some Hague mediations, and I could talk all day long about Hague mediations and why I think they're appropriate now, but I'll leave that for another day. Third point, these tips, of course, are free of charge. You get what you pay for, and they're worth as much as you pay for them. And there's no guarantees they'll work more successfully for you than they'd have for me. Perhaps they'll work more successfully for you than they have for me. Everyone's personality is, of course, totally different. And although they have worked and are tried and true for me, that may not be the case for you. This is free. It's you can pick and choose what you like and reject them or use them as you see fit. I'm curious as to any feedback, so please send me some emails if they work well for you. If they don't work well for you and litigants or counsel start yelling at you as a result of these tips, I don't want to hear from you. Finally, I feel a bit like a magician on that, what was that show on Fox, Secret Magicians Tricks Revealed. So I do feel a bit vulnerable sharing these tips, which I have kind of carefully cultivated and worked on for years. So I must love you or Marianne very much, and I hope you enjoy them. All right, that's basically my my start. So first tip. Okay, here we go. Where we go. First tip, you got a time machine. Does anyone recognize this vehicle, by the way? And if you do recognize it, you're probably as old as me. Of course, it's the DeLorean from the famous movie Back to the Future. So what is this all about, this tip? I would say that the biggest complaint that I get from litigants when I'm mediating is they're complaining about each other and they want to tell me a lot of history. And of course, they want that because they want me on their side. They want me on board. They want me to be in their corner. My view is that the history of a matter is important. Of course, it's important to know the history. It's important to know what happened. But too much focus on history, too much focus on he did this to her or she did this to him, kind of just keeps you in the mud. It prevents you from moving forward. It prevents you from getting people settled. And most important, it prevents you from being able to affect a significant and positive change with parties. And that's what you really, really, truly want to do if you're, trying to be the best mediator you can. You're trying to affect a change for something better that's meaningful and lasting. For example, whether it's more time with the children or less time with the children, more restrictions with the children or less restrictions, improving communication, having less communication between the parties, whatever it is that you're trying to do. It's hard to do when all you're hearing is, and then he did this in 1985, and then I did this in 1989. So how do you deal with that when you're the mediator? You're, of course, empowered to do whatever you want in terms of making suggestions, but how do you, in a way, transition people and get them, steering them into what you want, which is how to change and move forward? Well, I think about the time machine, and I'll usually stop after I've heard too much and I can't take any more. And I'll stop and I'll say, excuse me, ma'am or sir, can I ask you a question? And they always stop. And then, of course, you can ask me a question. And I'll pause and I'll say, do you have a time machine? And it's always the same response. I get like a stared look, like deer in the headlights. And they're like, what kind of question is that? And why is he asking that? And of course, the answer is always, no, I don't have a time machine. And I say, well, neither do I. I said, I don't have a time machine. If I did have a time machine, I would like to go back with you. And I'm sure that I could help you change some of the things that you were about to do, some of the decisions you were about to make, but I don't have a time machine. And so I can't go back and change things. But what I can do, and I always make sure to pivot to this, what I can do is help you and your spouse change things now for the future so that things are better for your children. And I kind of spin this into a whole thing about how statistics show that children from separated families do better when there is less conflict between the parties. And I expand on it by saying less chance of getting involved with the law, less chance of having premarital sex, less chance of having academic difficulties, less chance of leaving the house early. And I spin all these things and say, look, these are things you can change now by preventing conflict, by reducing the conflict, by taking some steps. So while I've heard the history and I get it, let's talk about what we can do now. And throughout the day, I bring back the time machine, because inevitably people nod and they go, oh yes, this is very helpful, this time machine analogy. But half an hour later, they're going to try and tell you a story that happened 7 years ago, and you understand, why they're telling you. So you don't need to hear 20 minutes of it. So I'll kind of politely put my finger up and I'll say, time machine? And they'll, oh yeah, time machine. Okay, I get it. Let's talk about what we can do forward. Okay, that's tip number one. And I find it very helpful, and I use it a fair bit, perhaps nauseatingly so. Tip number two. Where's tip number two? Tip number two, staying in your lane, the neighbor analogy. Okay, what's that all about? In so many parenting cases, so many parenting mediations I do, the nub of what is going on is a dispute between different styles, different values, different mores, and of course, different parenting approaches. All right, so much. And it can be conflict about disputes about the parent's morning routine, conflict about the bedtime routine, how much TV is watched, how much violent TV is watched, how much sugar is in the diet, what kind of diet, what is the new partner of one of the parties doing, what is the new partner of one of the parties not doing. It can be like a million things. And I'm constantly hearing about criticism of the other party's house, what's going on in the other party's house. Now, as we all know, as mediators, and I'm sure we've all tried this, even in intact families, people have different styles, different approaches, and that's even in intact families. And sometimes I tell people a bit about my own situation, and I'm in an intact family with a really great marriage, I'd like to think. And we have all kinds of different approaches to things that sometimes get us in conflict. So I try that. That usually doesn't work very well. I also have tried something where I'll stop and I'll say to the person, I'll say, you were aware, right, that there were about 8 billion people in the world that you could have chosen to have children with, and you chose this partner. And you have to be careful when you say something like that. You don't want to get people angry, but I make sure it's the right kind of person who can handle it. And they usually stop and reflect, and they get it. They're like, okay, I get what you're saying. I chose this person, warts and all. I kind of have to deal with them, warts and all. So I try that sometimes, and that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work so well. But the best tip that works is tip number 2, the neighbor analogy. And here's what I say. I'm going to just say it as if I'm talking to husband and wife in a mediation. And I'll say to them, I'll say, I'm going to share with you a story. I have a backyard, and the backyard has a deck. And I can stand on my deck anytime. And when I stand on my deck, I can see into my neighbor's backyard. And when he stands on his deck, he can see into my backyard. And I got to tell you, my neighbor is one major slob. His backyard is a complete mess. He doesn't mow his grass. He doesn't believe in fertilizer. The grass is 3 feet long. There's weeds everywhere. His patio furniture is all messed up and all over, very uneven. And the patio furniture is all over the place. Now, my backyard, it's like an anal retentive lawyer's dream. The patio furniture is always in the same place. The patio stones are perfectly shaved off. There's no grass that overlays them. The grass is nicely cut, and it's perfect. There's not a weed in sight. Now, when I stand in my backyard and I look into my neighbor's backyard, I can think whatever I want. I can think, boy, what a slob. I would never want to live that way. But am I allowed to kind of hop over the fence and move his patio furniture around? Am I allowed to do that? And of course, everyone always says, no, you're not allowed. Why? Why am I not allowed? Well, because there's a fence there and there's boundaries. I said, that's right. And is he allowed to think whatever he wants about me in my backyard? Sure, he's allowed to think it, but is he allowed to come and move my patio furniture around? Of course not, because there's a fence. So then I basically say to them, co-parenting is a lot like being a good neighbor. You can think what you want to think, but you got to keep it to yourself. Okay, the only exception when you're allowed to try and go into the other person's backyard and move around their patio furniture is if there's something that's endangering the children's safety. And that's a very, very rare occurrence. And so people really like the backyard analogy. And I swear in a typical mediation, at least 3 or 4 times over the course of a day, I got to bring it back because people get it. And then they fall back into traditional patterns where they're complaining about something the other side is doing that has no real bearing on the children's safety. It's just different. It's just different. than what they like and what they think it should be. So then I'll stop them. Backyard, this is a good backyard, and I'll do this. This is a good example of you going into the backyard. You're right, you're right. And so they, you give them the tools to try and take that to the next level so that they incorporate it on their own. And I always tell them, the next time before something comes up and before you write to your lawyer, before you send that angry text, ask yourself, am I going into the other side's backyard? So that I find is a very helpful tip as well. Tip three, the renovation syndrome while you're at it. Okay, there's my picture of a renovation of a house, luckily not my house. Okay, so what is tip three all about? Inevitably, the way I do my mediations is usually the lawyers contact me and we book a date for the mediation. So I've got that in my calendar, and then I set up a planning call with the lawyers to nail down all the details. And inevitably on these planning calls, which last about 15 to 30 minutes tops, everyone is extremely pleasant. It's just the lawyers, and everyone's so pleasant with each other. And we catch up and chit chat a bit. And the lawyers always say the same thing to me. Brahm, this case is really just a one issue case or a two issue case, and you should be able to settle it. And yet when I get the mediation briefs, like a week before the mediation, they're usually 300 or 400 pages. So I always say to myself, isn't this the case where they told me it was only one or two issues? So how does that happen? Okay. And so the way it happens is it's the renovation analogy. Think of when the contractor comes to your house to quote on what it costs to do your kitchen, right? You show him your kitchen, you kind of explain a bit about how you'd like your kitchen redone, and he gives you a quote. And then the first thing you think of is, while you're at it, how much to do the bathroom, right? While you're at it are the 5 most expensive words. And so that goes on all the time in family law and mediations. There's always 1 or 2 important, super important issues, but people know, oh, I'm already going to be dealing with this. I'm already having to file a brief. I'm already having to pay my lawyer. I'm already going to have Mr. Siegel sitting there and helping. I might as well deal with everything else that's bothering me about this situation, whether it's an issue with the parenting schedule that wasn't front and center before, but now it is. Maybe the children are expressing reluctance to go with one parent. Maybe it's maybe I should think about changing that spousal support. Maybe there's whatever the complaint is, it gets added on because while you're at it, it's like not that expensive to deal with. You've already built in the cost in your head. So why is this important to understand? Why is this significant? It's important to understand because as the mediator, in order to do a good job, you have to know that not everything is priority. Not everything is of equal weight. All right. And so what I do is I try to rely on the lawyers that I'm working with at the outset of the day to say, look, I've read the materials. My sense is that these things are the priority today, because if you treat everything as equal priority, you're going to fail. You're going to wind up at 4 p.m. with just a lot of discussion back and forth and nothing signed. So I try to get buy-in at the outset. And I must say I'm surprised that most of the time the lawyers agree right at the beginning of the day before I've delved into anything, what the 1 or 2 or 3 issues are that are priority. And I focus on those. And if I don't get to the other issues, I make it clear that we have another day we can book. It may not be tomorrow, the next day may not be next week, but we will book another day to deal with those things. And what I do is I try and mediate those issues that are most important. And in some cases, I'm not saying this works in all cases, but a kind of a tip 3.5 for this piece is sometimes I get people to sign off on each issue as it's settled. So let's say, for example, parenting schedule and temporary support are 2 of the 3 big issues. Sometimes I will, once I've reached an agreement on those things, I will put everyone in their waiting rooms, give everyone half an hour break, and I will type up a consent and get people to sign that consent right then and there, even though we still have 5 hours left, because I want people to feel like they got something accomplished. I do this often in cases where people have told me they've mediated before with other people and nothing got done. I want them to feel like I'm getting something done so that even if the other 5 hours that we have left, nothing is accomplished, at least they have a consent on these 2 issues. Now, again, it's not always possible. Sometimes there are good reasons to link everything together, but most of the time I find you can hive off issues and at least give people a sense of accomplishment. And that's important because at some point, someone's going to turn to you, whether it's the lawyer or the client, and they're going to say, yeah, my client's not feeling this. No, they're not feeling it. They're not feeling they're getting anything out of it. And you want to be able to say, really? This is the third time we've mediated, and each time we've done a consent. So there must be some progress that's measured along the line somewhere. Okay. So, and by the way, we'll get to this in the last tip. Do the drafting. I do not, I know it's easy to take a break, go get something to eat and tell the lawyers to do the drafting. I do the drafting, A, because I'm a fast typist, and B, the clients, even though the lawyers may not, but the clients perceive me as neutral, and I can do it quickly, and I'm very alive to what the hot button issues are. So I stay away from inflammatory language in the drafting. And I find that's extremely helpful and a big value add that you can give to the lawyers and clients that you're working. So I always do the drafting. Okay, tip number 4. How are we doing on time, Marianne?
Perfect. Awesome.
Okay. Okay. Tip number 4, meeting the kids. I was a bit reluctant to include this as a tip because I was fearful that it was just too damn obvious, but not so much, maybe not. I don't often meet children directly without lawyers, without parents, but I do. I would say once a month, once every 2 months. I never do it when I'm arbitrating for obvious reasons. I don't want to be a witness and have to be the decider in the same file. So I only do it when I'm mediating, and I only do it if the parties and the lawyers both agree. In terms of the way I do it, nothing special about it. I'll have one of the parents bring the child to my office at the end of the day. I give them a bit of a tour. We go for some snacks downstairs, bring them back, hang out in the boardroom, and just have a nice chat. And then I have the other parent picked up the child. So nothing special about that. But here's the tip. Before I do it, I make sure that the parents commit, not in writing, but just kind of tell me in person that they are going to really listen carefully and going to follow what the children say, because there is nothing worse than meeting with a child who is mature, has a really good sense of independence, and gives you some very good feedback in terms of what they want. And then you go to the parents and one of them says, well, we're not going to do that. There's nothing worse, because the child in meeting with you sees you a bit as a savior, a bit as a helper, a bit as someone who's going to put into effect what they want. And you want to be able to deliver that. You want to be able to give the child what they want most of the time. And there's nothing worse than reporting back to the parents, this is what your child clearly says, and then having nothing done about it. I had that recently. I had a 14-year-old child. Both parents said, oh, she's going to say X and X going to say Y. And the child surprised me by saying nothing negative about either parent, saying only nice things about both parents, and saying she wanted to keep the schedule as is, which was primarily with mom, but that in the summer, she wanted to try equal time. She wanted to try 1 month of 2-2-5 and the second month of 1 week on, 1 week off. I mean, I almost let the child take over the mediation because I thought that's a brilliant idea. I mean, she came up with this on her own. And I thought, wow, she's given this a lot of thought. So I was very confident when I went back to the parents and said, this is what your very intelligent, mature 14-year-old would like. I was just heartbroken when one parent said, yeah, that's great. I'm happy to sign that off. And the other parent said, no, won't do it. I was just really disappointed. And I kind of stood back and said, what could I have done better to get these parents to yes on that? And the answer was, I should have really held their feet to the fire better before I interviewed the child and said, look, if I'm going to do this, and if I find that the child's views are independent and well thought out, you're going to go along with it. I mean, otherwise, why am I doing this, right? You're both telling me different things about what your child wants. And I think looking back, I should have done a better job at that. And going forward, I am doing a much better job of making sure they commit to following through on what the child wants in most cases. I'm not talking about alienation cases where the child has clearly been toxified. I'm not talking about those cases. Tip number 5. Tip number 5 is my final parenting one. Tip number 5, making sure that they don't come back. Dust collectors and magnet holders. Okay, so this is all about making sure that people stay settled and don't re-engage with lawyers, mediators, and in conflict after they settle the case. And what I do is I tell them this. Again, I'm going to pretend that you are the litigants. I'll say to them, I'm going to tell you a story. When I was a young lawyer many years ago, starting off, I would always tell my clients at the end of the case, I'd say, you can be one of two kinds of client. You can be the kind of client that takes their agreement once it's signed, and you can put it in a drawer, and you can close the drawer. And when things come up in life, as they always do, new partners, children change wishes, problems develop, you can simply choose to leave that separation agreement in the drawer and let it collect dust and deal with things holistically, friendly, amicably. I said, or you can be the kind of client that takes the agreement with a big honking magnet, and you can stick it on your fridge. And every time that the other spouse transgresses one part of the separation agreement, you can write it down. You can send a note or a text to the other side. You can escalate it with an email. You can then re-engage the lawyers. And next thing you know, you can be back in mediation. And if you're lucky, back in court. So I always tell this to people. I said, now, which do you want to be? And every single client always said, well, that's easy. I'm the dust collector, Brahm, in this relationship. It's my spouse in the other room. That's the magnet holder. And so for years, like a dummy, I would walk around with my head in the sky thinking, I am just the luckiest family law lawyer around. I'm the only lawyer in town that has all the dust collectors. Meanwhile, all the other lawyers have the magnet holders. Until one day it dawned on me, what are the odds? What are the odds that in my 10 years of practice, I've never had a magnet holder? So it eventually dawned on me that people don't really see themselves the same way as other people do. And that even people who believe they are true dust collectors tend to have magnet holder tendencies. And so I use the dust collector magnet holder analogy when people are settled and when they are talking about what happens in the future, because I always get that. Can I call you back in the future? Can we re-engage? And that's when I bring in the dust collector magnet holder, and I try and make them believe that the absolute best thing for their file, in most cases, again, I'm not talking about serious cases where there's an absolute need and a justification. I try and explain to them, keep the agreement in the drawer, let it collect dust. Don't be a magnet holder. And that helps. And even when they're leaving at the end of the day, I usually get a nice hug. Yes, I'm going to try and be a dust collector, Mr. Siegel. I get that a lot. So I leave that to you, the dust collector magnet holder. And when you combine some of these tips, the dust collector magnet holder with staying in your own lane and being a good neighbor, it can actually be very powerful reminders to people, right? Let's move on. Tip number 6, the bottom line, keeping it under your hat. So in the old days, what would happen is you would just show up to a mediator's office. This would happen all the time at Phil Epstein's office, for example. And you would just show up and he would have read the mediation papers, but he had never met you as a litigant. He had never met either party. And most top financial mediators back then, that's what they did. These days, it's different. These days, almost all the excellent mediators do an intake session with each side. And I do one. I used to make it optional. And for the past 5 years, I make it mandatory. If the lawyers want to join, fine. But usually I try and encourage them not to join, just between me and the litigant. And in the intake, I spend about 30 minutes doing the following. I explain the process. I spend some time listening to the other side, give them a sense to tell me a bit about who they are, where they're from. And what I'm really listening for is how they think I can help for the mediation. And at the end, I take their credit card info, because I always found it a bit of a pain for lawyers to have to write checks to the mediator. So I do all those things in the intake. If it's an arbitration, I spend a bit more time on domestic violence, power sharing, power imbalance issues, asking some more questions about that. The reason I'm telling you this is one of the key things I do in the explanatory part of the intake session is I explain to people how valuable it is to have a fifth person going back and forth. So most of the mediations I do, most of the day I'm shuttling, I'm going back and forth. And so I tell people in the intake, I say, look, when I'm in your room with your lawyer, anything that you tell me that's a factual nature, if you win the lottery the night before, if you got a promotion and the other side doesn't know it, that's not confidential. I must and I will share that with the other side. But if you tell me something that's settlement oriented, something about an offer, a proposal you're thinking of making, I will not share that with the other side. I will keep that under my hat. And I even go further and I say, if you have a bottom line that you don't want the other side to know, but you want me to know, That is very helpful, and I can assure you it will stay under my hat. And I give people the following example. This is not really a tip, but it's a good example to use so people understand how powerful it is. And I'll say to them, let's say I'm talking to the husband. I'll say to him, let's say, husband, you tell me that you are content to settle the case for a payment of $50,000. But you don't want to offer that $50,000 because you believe that if you offer $50,000, the other side will come back and revise the offer. Next thing you know, you're going to be at a much higher number. So you want me to go in there and you want me to offer $40,000. Fine. I will go into the other room and say, your wife, say to the wife, your husband is only offering $40,000. I will not share with her that you are prepared to pay $50,000. Similarly, though, I will tell him when I go into the wife's room and ask her if she says, 40,000 is too low. I'm prepared to accept 50, but I know my husband. And if I tell you that, and if he goes in and understands that I'm willing to settle for 50, he's going to come back with 45K. And I'm not willing to settle for 45K. I'm willing to settle for 50. So I want you to go into the other room, Siegel, and tell him that my number is 60. Then I will do that. I will go into his room and I'll say, her number, she rejected 40. Her number is 60. But here's the interesting dynamic. I am now the only person in both rooms who know that both parties would settle for 50. So I know that. And without giving away any confidence, what I'll do is I'll say to the lawyers, would you like a suggestion? And they always say yes. And I'll say, can I suggest that maybe you guys think of a number around 50K? And the lawyers always say the same thing. They say, well, we'll have to speak to our clients and get back to you. But because each client has already told me that they're willing to take 50K, there's usually a good chance that what comes back is the lawyers say, my client will take 50 if the other side takes 50. And next thing you know, that's how you get a deal. So I tell that to people in the intake. I give them that as an example to show them how powerful having a fifth person in the room is who understands what to keep under the hat, what to keep in the vault. And because I couldn't find a good picture of a vault on Google Images, I used a hat. Okay. So that is a very helpful tip that I like. I try very hard to avoid kind of splitting down the middle. I find that very unsatisfying for a lot of people, including myself. I try very hard not to make concrete recommendations, especially try to avoid making concrete recommendations if I'm the arbitrator, because I don't want to make it look like I've prejudged the issue. If I am going to make a recommendation, I make sure the lawyers are up for it. I usually wait till the end of the day or midpoint through the day after I've done the intakes, after I've read the briefs, after I've spent a good chunk of time in each room, after I've chatted with the lawyers. I don't want to make a recommendation not having the full and complete picture. And of course, if I'm also arbitrating, I'll still make a recommendation, but I make sure to preface it. And this is a good suggestion, I think, for anyone. I preface it with saying things like, the evidence may come out very different at an arbitration. I'm only basing a recommendation on what I have right here in the mediation materials. You can't hold me to this. Things could be different. I always try and act as if I'm being recorded, right? There was a famous case years ago, Keynes and Potter, where the mediator got into a lot of trouble because he said all kinds of very, very concrete things in mediation. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that if you don't settle. And he was recorded, allowed himself to be recorded. And of course, a judge wound up overturning everything he did. So I always try and act as if I'm being recorded, even though, of course, people aren't supposed to record and they tell me that they're not. So that's really all tip number 6. A few more to go. Tip number 7, the lump sum, freedom at last. When I did a lot of mediations as a young lawyer with Epstein Cole, Phil Epstein had a habit, and his habit was really funny. What he would do is when things were really looking dire, he would take the husband out on his veranda upstairs, and he would put his arm around the usually the payor husband, and he would ask him. He would say, "Sir, what do you see when you look at the sky?" And the guy would be stunned. "What do you mean? Why is Phil Epstein putting his arm around me? And why is he asking me to look at the sky?" And Phil would say, "When you see the sky, what do you see?" And the guy would say, "Buildings." And Phil would say, "No, I don't see buildings. I see freedom. I see freedom." And the guy would always turn and go, "Freedom. Yes, that's what I want. I want freedom. I want freedom to be done with this case. I want freedom to be done with my spousal support obligations. Phil, how do I get freedom?" So tip number 7 is think about lump sums. As mediators, As a mediator, I do a lot of work where I am helping people settle with a lump sum, particularly on spousal support. Very, very rare that you will do a case where you will settle all child support obligations for a lump sum. I do it. They're very rare. They're cases where the children are close to the end date for termination, where the costs are known, where the incomes of the parties are known, where the Section 7s for remaining post-secondary are known. But again, very careful to do that. Most of the time, it's almost all spousal support. Now, why is lump sum spousal support so popular? It's not popular because of me. It's popular because of what it accomplishes. Recipients, usually wives, worry all the time that the payer will stop paying, or unilaterally stop paying, or change his job status, or have a negative change of health, or get a new partner that's chirping in his ear and say, why are you paying so much? You know, my friend down the street is using, you know, a different lawyer, and his clients are paying far less. Similarly, the payor has concerns too. The payor, usually man, usually the husband, worries he'll never stop paying, that there's never going to be an end date, that they're going to be paying into retirement and have no money to retire on, no savings. They worry also about spousal support going up. They've all heard stories about how when child support ends, spousal support can go up in particular cases. They worry about their support recipients' health deteriorating and having to pay more there. They worry about their support recipients' job status changing. In short, there are a host of reasons, most of which I'm sure you're aware and don't need me to remind you, of why people worry about ongoing payments. And yet time and time again, people are coming into mediations and they haven't really explored a lump sum. So I like lump sums because they avoid legal fees in the future. They avoid people tangling and having future conflicts. They avoid people fighting about inquiries. What are you doing with your life now? Why aren't you working full time? You know, how much money is your new partner earning? They avoid mediation arbitration fees. They avoid fights about disclosure. There's a lot of pros to a lump sum. Now, of course, the amount of the lump sum is always the key. And I don't think it's too complicated to understand that that is going to depend. It's going to depend on the length of time they were together. It's going to depend on the ages of the parties. It's going to depend on what child support obligations are in effect, what sort of Section 7s are in effect. It's going to depend also on the expected duration of support. We get a lot of people who, when they turn 65, it's reasonable to expect they're going to go on pension. And we see a lot of people, particularly white collar jobs, who work until their 80s, late 70s. And so it wouldn't necessarily be reasonable to expect that spousal support would stop when they turn 65. And of course, it depends on means, right? Means, when I say means, I don't just mean looking at their financial statement and how much they got in a bank account, but how much access to means they have. So frequently I'm putting a pause in the negotiations during the day while a payer consults their significant other to find out if she's agreeable to using their joint line of credit to fund the lump sum. I just had one the other day, very stressful. Sometimes people are calling their mother, their brother, their sister for various loans. I had one the other day where most of the day was spent waiting for the bank or the mortgage broker to get back to find out what amount of financing they would qualify for so they could understand how much money to pull out of their home to pay for a lump sum. This takes time. Ideally, you want people to show up to your mediation with all their financing all lined up. That doesn't happen all the time. And when it does, you're really impressed. But you got to expect that it doesn't, because most of the time people haven't really thoughtfully thought it through. The one tip I'll give you also is watch out when you're seeing lump sum calculations, when people are sending you their briefs. Sometimes these lump sum calculations are so out of whack because people will put indefinite duration when it's clear that at the most the payor has 7 years to go, or 6 years to go, or 10 years to go. And so it's your job. People are retaining you for your judgment. It's important for you to put your foot down when necessary and say, it's not reasonable to use a lump sum based on an indefinite date when we know for sure that he's going to be out of a job when he turns 70 and no judge is going to force him to go back to work. I'm not saying that's appropriate in every case. I'm just giving you an example. But where it's appropriate to use a particular finite duration, you got to use it. Otherwise, the lump sum number is so out of whack and people have ridiculous expectations. So again, the big point here for the lump sum is freedom. And that moves to tip number 8, only a few more to go. Then we'll take some questions if you like. Fixed and non-variable, more freedom at last. I do a ton of cases where people are fighting about adjustments. They're fighting about retroactive support. And I painstakingly take the time in every year to figure out what the incomes were in every year, actual income earned in each year. And I compare it to what was paid, and I net it out for tax, and I calculate whether there was an underpayment or an overpayment. I'm doing that, I would say, at least 2 out of every 3 mediations. And then the issue is always, well, what about going forward, right? We don't want to have to come back here and do this again. This was a very painful exercise and expensive. The solution, fixed and non-variable. So one of the great advantages about mediation is you can do a fixed and non-variable deal because you're not going to get it in front of a judge. Judges are not going to make fixed and non-variable orders. The closest you'll get to a fixed and non-variable order from a judge is maybe a step-down order, where a judge says, I think support should end in 5 years. And in year 1 and 2, it's going to be $5,000 a month. Years 2 and 3, it's going to drop down to $3,500 a month. And year 4 and 5, it's going to drop down to $1,000 a month, and then it's going to stop. That's the closest you're going to get. Most judges, and they'll tell you this all the time, is if you go to a trial, a judge is going to pick an amount and make it subject to a material change, variation, subject to a material change in circumstances. So by the time I get people in my boardroom, they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that just with a variation on a material change, they could be back fighting again. They want it to be over, and they want, as much as possible, finality and certainty. So a fixed and non-variable amount can do that. You can say a defined amount for a fixed period of time, and it's not changeable under any circumstances. And you can make it, and of course, most of these payments are periodic. So they're deductible to the payor and includable to the recipient. And I put all kinds of language in about how it's not variable under any circumstances and how the parties have considered the law and their options and all that sort of stuff. And I also sometimes will put in a clause that makes it a little bit variable. So variable if there's a catastrophe. So for example, if the amount that the payor is paying depends on his income, like sometimes the payor's amount that he's paying monthly, fixed and non-variable, he can pay it out of capital, and he's happy to do so. But often the payment is based on him being able to stay at that job. So important to put in wording about what happens in the event of a catastrophe, which is a higher standard than a material change. And I spend a lot of time with lawyers, I was going to say fighting, but negotiating with them what the wording is, that what constitutes a catastrophe, because and what happens if one person says there's a catastrophe and the other doesn't. You have to spend quite a bit of time detailing that language. But in terms of the concept, fixed and non-variable, it's super, super helpful for people who want to avoid disclosure fights, right? It's super helpful for people who want to stay out of each other's hair. It's super helpful for people who want to avoid more legal mediator fees. It's super helpful for people who have a decent sense of what the other side is going to be earning. So if people's income wildly fluctuates, it's harder to do because people think, oh, maybe I'm giving up too much away. But if you have a good sense roughly of what the other side is earning, it's much more achievable. It's very good for people who aren't going to really stress and fuss about what happens if things don't work out as they think. So for example, if you have a support recipient who says, you know what, I'm happy for him and his new partner. All I really need is $7,000 a month for my budget, and he can do what he wants. If you really believe that, that's a good case for fixed and non-variable, because even if his income skyrockets or he does way better after the settlement, it's not going to bother her, right? Contrast that with someone who's very, very connected still emotionally with the other partner, and they're going to be very, very concerned that they gave up too much. And the minute the deal is done, the other side's going to earn way more money. And then they feel like they've been tricked or they lost out. Because I say to them, how are you going to feel if you do a fixed and non-variable amount for this money you want, and then you find out 6 months later he wins the lottery, or you find out 6 months later he gets a promotion, or you find out 6 months later he's not working at all because he's taken care of by his new partner? How are you going to feel? And if the answer is, I'm good with it, okay, then you know you might have a good framework for fixed and non-variable. If the answer comes back is, I'm going to be furious and I'm going to rue the day I met you, Mr. Siegel, maybe fixed and non-variable isn't for you, and maybe these people are better off with being able to come back and fight with any little change. But most people really, really like it. But you need to take the time as mediator explaining the benefits. And I also spend time explaining the disadvantages, because it's not for everyone. All right. So that's fixed and non-variable. And of course, you can use fixed and non-variable in conjunction with a lump sum. and I do that too in appropriate cases where people don't have enough of a lump sum available to them. I pair it, right? How about a fixed and non-variable with a lump sum? And then I'll explain why I think it might be a good idea in this case, and I'll gauge the reaction of the clients and the lawyers. I get a lot of uptake on those sorts of pairings. All right, 2 more tips, and then I'm tired of hearing my voice, so I'll end there. Tip number 9, the bad first pancake. This is my newest tip, the bad first pancake. Do you ever notice when you bake pancakes for your kids, the first one always comes out lousy? Do you notice that? Okay, I see Marianne nodding. That's me. First one's always lousy. I don't know why. The heat is too high. I can't get the right temperature. There's not enough butter. I don't know. So what do people say? Throw out the first pancake. So what I do with my mediations is after I've spent most of the morning spending time in each room, getting more information, thinking about the case, I usually sit down with the lawyers at about lunchtime and kind of share some impressions. And most of the afternoon is spent with proposals. You know, one side usually initiates a proposal and I give it to the other side, and we spend time going back and forth, drilling down to see if we can agree on terms. Inevitably, no matter what I say or what I do, inevitably the first proposal is pie in the sky. The first proposal and the first response are inevitably so out of whack with what is realistic, but people want to make sure they're not leaving anything on the table. So the proposals are usually they're so far apart that there's a temptation after the first round, there's a temptation to pick up and leave. And I get that all the time. And I've been guilty of that as counsel. I've been to many mediations where I'll say to Danny Malamed, you know, I thought this was going to be a productive day, but it's 1:30 and the parties are still, you know, $2 million apart. This is a waste of time. And, you know, good mediators will say, be patient. It's just like the first pancake. You got to throw it out. You got to take it with a grain of salt. Just because you see a first offer for pie in the sky does not mean that that's that person's bottom line. Does not mean they won't be reasonable as the day goes on. Does not mean they can't be flexible. Okay. Now, the only thing I'll say as a little caveat here is as the day goes on, I become a lot less of a messenger back and forth, and I become a lot more evaluative. So when I see at the end of the day that someone is not moving enough or that their proposal is still highly unreasonable, I will say to them, I am not taking this proposal to the other room. And that's a very, very powerful thing you can do as mediator, to say to someone, I'm not taking this into the other room, but you have to be careful and you have to be able to explain why you're not doing it, right? You have to say why this offer at this stage of the game is going to be so destructive that the only reason I should send this offer to the other room is if you want to blow up the day. And usually people listen very, very carefully. And I say, I'm going to leave. I want you to revise this offer with your lawyer. And usually I would say 80% of the time when I come back, they have a much better offer. And I can say to the other side, I'll say, look, this offer took a long time to get. And it wasn't their first offer on this. And that's why it took so long. I even, told them I wouldn't convey the first offer. And I'll say that, I won't say what it is, but I'll convey that. And that is important because, again, you're not just the messenger. People have hired you, even if you're in the context of a mediation as part of an arbitration, people are hiring you for your judgment. They're not hiring you, I always say, for your dashing good looks and your dance moves. At least in my case, that's definitely not the case. So people are hiring me because at some point the lawyers must have said, well, we value what he's thinking. We value his judgment. You need to use it. But like anything, you need to use it sparingly at the right times and the right moments. And if you do, and of course this comes with experience, it's very, very effective. Okay. Final tip. I've kind of already alluded to the final tip, so it's really kind of anticlimactic. The final tip is tip 10, do and control the drafting. Okay. Again, super, super easy at 5 o'clock when everyone has shaken hands and said, yeah, we have an agreement on these 10 things, to say, well, folks, I got to go to my kid's baseball game. Good luck to you. Good luck with the agreement. And if you need help, just give me a call. That's the easy way out. And I don't do that. And I think one of the reasons people come to me and some other mediators, I'm not the only one, is because I will tell everyone to take a break and I will race to my computer and I will type up the damn thing as much as possible. Now, I usually call it a MOBA, minutes of binding agreement. So it's perfectly clear that the terms are binding. I even put wording in to say that any clause in here, the entirety of the agreement, can be incorporated into a court order or an arbitral award, making it perfectly clear. I also, if the case is something that involves lots of releases and lots of future clauses that I haven't had time to mediate, life insurance, mobility, health expenses, all that sort of stuff, which people don't usually come to me for, then I will put in clauses that say these terms are valid. These terms are binding, whether or not you get a separation agreement that includes all this other stuff. And I will put in clauses that say the parties intend to do a separation agreement covering not just this stuff that's been agreed to today, but all these other issues, and I'll list what the issues are. Husband's lawyer will prepare a draft and send it to the wife's lawyer by, and I'll put a date in. And of course, it's always subject to the lawyer's availability. Wife's lawyer will provide written comments by this date. Separation agreement will be signed by this date. If it's not signed, parties will have a conference call with me where I'll try and help them with the wording, stuff like that. So sometimes I can get it all done in one day with all the releases and all the bells, but often in complicated cases, there's still other paperwork that needs to be done. The key here, of course, is making sure that what is agreed is carefully detailed and binding and not linked to the separation agreement being signed, because the separation agreement may not be signed. People often wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I gave away too much. I was too nice in the negotiation. I let Mr. Siegel and the lawyer on the other side push me around too much, and I'm not signing that damn separation agreement. They think that's a way to get out of the MOBA. And you have to make sure it's properly drafted. Otherwise, there's all kinds of cases we've heard where, is this an agreement to agree? Is this a binding agreement? One of the things, and I'll mention him for the last time because he was such an amazing mediator. Phil Epstein was amazing at getting people to say yes, but there were lots of challenges on his cases with getting people signed up because he didn't sit down and draft for an hour, hour and a half. He would either speak into a dictaphone and kind of just set out the key terms, or his clerk would draft something super quick, or there would be no drafting at all, and he would kind of just trust the lawyers to get it done. There were a lot of cases he had to deal with later on where this would come up, right? Oh no, that wasn't part of the deal. This was part of the deal, and then people trying to use that to get out of the deal altogether. He even had a very famous case involving Lauren Wolfson, where Phil went around the room and had people say into the microphone, I agree with these terms, and nothing was signed. And sure enough, the next day, the husband said, I didn't agree. I'm not agreeable to that. And it led to a whole 2 years more worth of litigation. So what I do is I draft the thing, and if it's late in the day, let's say it's 5 or 6 o'clock, I tell people to go home, turn off the Zoom, and I get them to rejoin at 8 or 9 p.m., which is not fun, but it really does keep the momentum going. It gives me time to draft, to go home, to put something in my mouth to eat, and then we all sign on again. By then, the lawyers have reviewed the draft with their clients. They understand that the push is to get it signed today. And I go over the changes with the lawyers only on the Zoom, making the changes, sending it back out by email again, and hopefully getting it all electronically signed, by the end of the day. It works. It's a long day. It's tiring. You're tired in the morning when you wake up, but boy, it feels good. And you get a lot of nice emails thanking you for pushing through and not just leaving everyone to their own. So drafting and doing it by yourself, doing the drafting yourself, a very effective tip that has really proved helpful for me. That is it in terms of your 10 not so secret tips anymore. Use them effectively, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Great. These are fantastic, Brahm. I think it's wonderful, the storytelling that you shared your tips with, and the analogies are, the chat, people are really interested in these. One question was about, the difference really between lawyer assisted mediation, counsel present mediation, and where a lot of us are working without counsel present and the ILA comes after. And the fixed and non-variable piece, a question was like, is that harder when counsel is not present? Do you see a stumbling block or a roadblock for mediators who don't have counsel present using the fixed and non-variable?
So while I do sometimes mediate without counsel, I always find it a real challenge. And to those who mediate without counsel and are successful in getting people signed, I applaud them, because I don't seem very successful at it. And the reason I don't seem very successful at it is because whatever I mediate with the parties present, whenever it gets sent to the lawyers, one of the lawyers is saying, don't do it. You're giving too much away. If I'd have been there, this wouldn't have been done. So I like everyone in the room, and I find that it's not very helpful. And I find that it's also a way for people to try and get out of what was tentatively agreed on in mediation. And again, it tends to lead to this agreement to agree business where people seem to think they have a deal, then they go to a lawyer, and the lawyer's just doing their job by giving advice, right? I'm giving you advice on what I think. I'm not trying to get my teeth and my claws into this agreement to make money, to bill it, to blow it up. I'm just giving you good advice. But then they go back to the mediator and say, well, when I met with you without lawyers, I thought this was a good deal, but I went to my lawyer and they said this is a terrible idea, that fixed and non-variable is not enforceable, and that this is a waste of time. And right. So I really try to avoid that. And it's really helpful having the lawyers who you've worked with before, sign on and buy into the concept. And again, it's not always a good solution for every case. I want to stress that. But where it is a good solution, usually the lawyers are right into it and they buy in. And often they'll say something like, I had thought of that too, Mr. Siegel. I just didn't put it in my brief. It better coming from you. Okay, fine, no problem. You can take the credit.
That's funny. I think that, when I think about a lot of our members who are family mediators that are working without counsel, one of the best tips I've heard is in the ILA presentation that OAFM made with Law Pro and the Winkler Institute and Family Law Limited Scope, where it's just having a relationship with each other, so that if I send something to you as an independent legal advice lawyer for one of the clients, that I've talked to you about it, that you understand where it's coming from. And in the absence of that, write it all in the memorandum or the mediation report. So it's like, here's the facts and here's the way that they made the decision. And I think, peppering it with information that they can take out is much better than leaving it out and just saying, like, why on earth would they do this? What was the reasoning? Because
super helpful.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the nice.
That's a great tip. So if you are going to mediate without counsel and they are going to do something, and then you find yourself bumping up with the ILA advice, it's really helpful to get on the phone. We don't do that enough these days. Get on the phone and say, look, this was what was going on in the room. This was the interests that were identified. And that's why I suggested A, B, or C. That should help.
For sure. And it's not good enough just to say, which I've been guilty of saying, is they're really friendly. They get along really well.
I never say that. I never wind up saying that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a mistake because it's not about that for the lawyers. The lawyers are asked to do a job. And if you have a chance, people who are watching, there's a really good presentation that is on the OAFM website under independent legal advice. And it just kind of goes through a few tips. Are there any other questions? People want your top 10 tip slides. I don't know if we can talk about that afterwards.
Yeah, of course. No problem.
Okay. So if you do want a copy of the slides, will you email me directly and then I'll be able to send them to you? There are like 90 people here. So it's a lot of faces and names to remember, but it's wonderful to see you. Let me see. One new message come in. Background for reasoning. Yes, this is absolutely essential, I think. Are there any last questions for Brahm before he goes about his day and solves the problems of the world?
Oh, yeah.
Feel free to unmute and say hello, because we're all friends here.
I just had one quick question for Brahm there. By the sounds of it, all your mediations are in a shuttle format. Why is that?
I start them all in shuttle. There are occasions in mediations where I bring everyone into the same room, which I didn't feel that had time to talk about today. But those are cases where there's a big discrepancy in the NFP statements. I like to save time and have everyone in the room for that. There are cases where there's just so much fighting about parenting that it's more effective for me to read both of them, the Riot Act, at the same time. And I'll have everyone facing me and not looking at each other. Sometimes it's really important for one lawyer to hear what the other client is saying, not for the spouse to hear what the other side is saying, but for the other lawyer to hear what the spouse is saying. So I will try and set that up in appropriate cases where I feel there's just some misinformation. I had one recently where there was just, in my view, a complete lack of information from payor to recipient. And as a result, recipient and her lawyer had all these fanciful ideas about what the payor could earn. And it was his own fault because he didn't convey information about what his job was and how it had changed and all that. And I just got the sense that if I had everyone in the same room and allowed wife's lawyer to pepper him with as many questions as she wanted, that would unlock the day. And it did. It took a while to set up. And of course, everyone understood why I was doing it. And I monitored everything to make sure it didn't get into like a formal questioning. But it wound up settling the day because with equal information, they were able to settle. So I do have people in the same room, just I'm very careful about it.
So on that, then comparatively to your process versus like a collaborative process, have you done any collaborative work or?
I am trained in collaborative family law and I do collaborative family law as counsel. All the mediations I do, take different shapes and forms and involve me being either less or more evaluative as the need arises. So the way I think of it is, you use your personality and your skills as they see fit with every mediation. So even though every mediation it seems that I'm doing is dealing with, retroactive adjustments and ongoing support, the personalities, the issues, what's important to people is different in every case. And I always like to say that's why this job is so fulfilling and challenging. So I don't know if that answers your question, but every style is different and every mediation is different.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. A quick question from Raquel for the last word, and then we'll let you get on with your day.
Sure.
I just have a kind of embarrassed. I'm not wearing any makeup. I'm usually prettier than this, but anyway.
Neither am I. It's okay. Neither am I.
I was going to keep my screen off, but I couldn't help but ask a question. I'm just wondering where you want clients to sign something before they leave. I always worry though that sometimes there's a benefit to them sleeping on it, to going home. Like, are you worried that they're going to be signing something they're later going to regret? Because they, at the end of the day, they're so depleted, like it's so emotionally charged for them. It's exhausting for us as mediators or counsel, but when it's their lives on the line, and sometimes should they not have the benefit of being able to sleep on it before they sign?
The short answer to me is no. The short answer is if you let them sleep on it, they will be further apart the next day, and people will, for the most part, think that they will focus on what they gave up. And they will go to their lawyer and say, what about this? And what about that? And don't you think I gave up this? They won't wake up in the morning and say, you know what? Siegel was being really evaluative and fair on both sides. And my ex made those really big concessions. I think I want to sign. I guess that could happen in theory, but most of the time people worry about what they gave up, And so it's a cost benefit analysis. Overall, I think the benefits to people of settling and moving on with their lives, even though they may have left something on the table. After all, a mediation does involve compromise on both sides. I always tell people it doesn't mean that you're both compromising the same amount. It depends on the facts of each case and their positions and the strengths thereof. But the benefits of settling your case and moving on with the benefit of legal advice at the time. I'm not talking about forcing people to sign when they don't have lawyers there that day. Again, that's not the mediation that I do, and I don't think any good mediator would do that. But the benefits of getting it done far outweigh the stress, time, expense of it continuing. And usually, sometimes what I do is the day after mediation, I'll email the parties directly, even though they don't have counsel. I'll email them each one on their own, and I'll ask them how they feel. What do you think the biggest word is that they say how they feel? Relieved. Relieved is the biggest word. They don't say I'm overjoyed. Yeah. They don't say, oh, I got the world's best deal. They say they're relieved. And that to me is a sign that we are fulfilling our duties and mandates as good professionals.
Right. Yeah, and I guess they wouldn't feel that without having it signed. So even if, leaving it open leaves the questions. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much to Brahm for sharing your style, and really you made yourself vulnerable. You shared what you do, and I think that as us and mediators working in our own office is so valuable to see what we're all doing. And I think you're exactly right that each family requires a different approach, and the fact that you're able to do that for families in the way that you do, it sounds like they're really well served. So thank you for sharing your tips, and thank you for OAFM members for coming. And if you want a copy of the slides, please email me, and I will definitely get those out for you. Bram's already sent them, so we're all set.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.